What happens when Hollywood royalty meets actual royalty on daytime television's most controversial stage? You won't believe what unfolds when Meghan Markle sits down with Whoopi Goldberg on The View, thinking she's walking into a friendly chat about her latest projects. Instead, she finds herself facing the most brutal interrogation of her post-royal career, with tensions so thick you could cut them with a knife. This isn't just another celebrity interview gone wrong. This is a masterclass in how quickly things can spiral completely out of control when two strong-willed women refuse to back down. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below because you're not going to believe what unfolds when these two powerhouses go head-to-head in what starts as polite conversation and ends in absolute chaos. The atmosphere in the View studio felt different from the moment Meghan Markle walked onto the set. There was an electric tension in the air that even the studio audience could sense, though they had no idea they were about to witness television history in the making. Whoopi Goldberg sat at the iconic table, her expression unreadable behind those signature glasses, while Joy Behar and Sunny Hostin flanked her sides like loyal soldiers ready for battle. Meghan glided onto the stage with her usual poise, wearing an elegant cream-colored blazer that seemed to glow under the studio lights. She waved to the audience with practiced grace, but those paying close attention might have noticed the slight tremor in her smile, as if some part of her already sensed what was coming. The applause was warm but not overwhelming, a far cry from the thunderous reception she once received during her first post-Oprah media appearances. "Welcome back to The View," Whoopi began, her voice carrying that distinctive gravitas that had commanded respect in Hollywood for decades. "We're here with Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, actress, philanthropist, and someone who certainly knows a thing or two about making headlines." The words seemed innocent enough, but there was something in Whoopi's tone, a subtle edge that suggested this wouldn't be the typical softball interview Meghan had grown accustomed to. Meghan settled into her chair, crossing her legs gracefully, and flashing that megawatt smile that had once charmed millions. "Thank you so much for having me, Whoopi. It's always wonderful to be here with such strong, intelligent women." Her voice carried that carefully modulated tone she'd perfected over years of public speaking, each word measured and deliberate. Joy leaned forward slightly, her eyes sparkling with what might have been mischief or genuine curiosity. "So, Meghan, you've been keeping busy with your various projects. Tell us about what you're working on these days." It was a standard opening question, the kind designed to ease guests into comfortable territory before diving deeper. "Well, I'm incredibly excited about several initiatives we're launching through Archewell," Meghan began, her hands gesturing elegantly as she spoke. "We're really focused on creating meaningful change and giving voice to communities that have been underrepresented. It's work that's very close to my heart, and I feel like we're finally in a position where we can make a real difference in people's lives." Sunny nodded approvingly, her expression warm and encouraging. "That's wonderful work you're doing. The foundation has been making quite an impact." The supportive comment seemed to relax Meghan slightly, her shoulders dropping just a fraction, as she settled more comfortably into her chair. But Whoopi remained silent, studying Meghan with an intensity that was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. The veteran host had conducted thousands of interviews over her career, and she possessed an almost supernatural ability to read people, to see past the carefully constructed facades that celebrities presented to the world. Something about Meghan's perfectly polished responses was setting off alarm bells in her mind. "That's all very admirable," Whoopi finally interjected, her voice cutting through Meghan's continued explanation of her charitable work. "But I have to ask, and I think our audience deserves honesty here. How do you reconcile all this talk about giving voice to the underrepresented when you've spent the last few years living in a $30 million mansion and signing multi-million-dollar deals with streaming platforms?" The question hit the studio like a thunderbolt. The audience fell silent, sensing the sudden shift in energy. Meghan's smile faltered for just a moment before she recovered, but that brief crack in her composure didn't go unnoticed by Whoopi or the cameras capturing every micro-expression. "I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding about what wealth and privilege mean in the context of service," Meghan replied, her voice maintaining its measured tone despite the obvious provocation. Having resources doesn't disqualify someone from fighting for those who don't have the same advantages. If anything, it creates a responsibility to use those resources for good. Whoopi leaned back in her chair, her expression skeptical. That's a very convenient way to look at it. But let's be real here. You left the royal family claiming you wanted privacy and a normal life for your children, and then you immediately signed deals to put your life on display for the highest bidder. How do you explain that contradiction to people who might be watching right now, struggling to pay their rent? The challenge was direct and unmistakable. This wasn't going to be another puff piece interview where Meghan could control the narrative and deliver her prepared talking points. Whoopi was clearly in the mood for a real conversation, and she wasn't going to let carefully crafted PR responses slide by unchallenged. Meghan's posture straightened slightly, her hands clasping together. In her lap, "I think you're oversimplifying a very complex situation, Whoopi." The decision to step back from royal duties wasn't just about privacy. It was about being able to live authentically and raise our children in an environment where they could be themselves without the constant scrutiny and, frankly, the racism that we were experiencing within that institution. Racism, Whoopi repeated, the word hanging in the air like a loaded weapon. That's a serious accusation to make about an entire institution. And you've made it repeatedly, in various interviews and platforms. But here's what I don't understand. If the situation was so unbearable, so toxic, why didn't you speak up while you were there? Why wait until after you left to make these claims? Joy and Sunny exchanged glances, both sensing that this interview was taking a much more confrontational turn than anyone had anticipated. The energy in the studio was becoming palpable, with even the crew members behind the cameras seeming to hold their breath as they watched this verbal sparring match unfold. Meghan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but her voice remained controlled. Sometimes it takes distance and perspective to fully understand what you've experienced. And I think it's important to note that speaking out about these issues isn't about attacking the institution. It's about creating accountability and hopefully preventing others from going through similar experiences. But that's just it, Whoopi pressed, her voice gaining intensity. You keep talking about accountability. But where's your accountability? You've made millions of dollars telling your story, over and over again, to anyone who'll pay you for it. At what point does seeking justice become exploiting trauma for profit? The accusation struck home with surgical precision. For the first time since the interview began, Meghan's composure showed visible cracks. Her hands tightened in her lap, and her voice carried a slight edge when she responded. I find it incredibly disappointing that when women, particularly women of color, speak their truth about difficult experiences, they're immediately accused of profiting from trauma. Would you rather I stayed silent? Would that have been more palatable for everyone? Whoopi's eyes narrowed behind her glasses, and there was no mistaking the steel in her voice when she replied. Don't you dare try to make this about race when it's about credibility. I've been fighting for civil rights and calling out racism long before you even knew what a spotlight was. This isn't about silencing women of color. This is about holding people accountable for their actions and their words, regardless of their background. The studio fell into an uncomfortable silence, the tension so thick it seemed to press against everyone present. Even the usually chatty studio audience was completely quiet, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented unfold before their eyes. But this was just the beginning, and everyone in that studio was about to discover just how much more explosive this confrontation was going to become. Meghan's eyes flashed with something dangerous as she processed Whoopi's words. The careful mask of composure she'd worn throughout her public life was beginning to slip, revealing something raw and unfiltered underneath. You know what, Whoopi? I came here expecting to have a respectful conversation about important issues. But it's clear you've already made up your mind about who I am and what my motivations are. Have I? Whoopi shot back, her voice rising slightly. Because from where I'm sitting, I'm just asking the questions that a lot of people are thinking but are too polite to ask. You want to talk about respect? Let's talk about the respect you showed to the Queen, to an institution that's centuries old, when you aired your family's dirty laundry on international television for a paycheck. Joy attempted to interject, sensing the conversation was spiraling beyond typical daytime television territory. Ladies, maybe we can. No, Joy. Whoopi cut her off sharply, never taking her eyes off Meghan. This needs to be said. Because I'm tired of watching people destroy institutions and relationships and then play victim when they face consequences for their choices. Meghan's laugh was cold and bitter, completely devoid of the warmth she'd shown just minutes earlier. Destroy institutions? The only thing I destroyed was the illusion that those institutions were as pure and noble as people wanted to believe. I told the truth about what happened to me, about how I was treated, and somehow that makes me the villain in this story. Truth. Whoopi's voice dripped with skepticism. Whose truth? Because funny thing about truth, it usually stays consistent. But your story seems to change depending on which platform is paying you to tell it. First it was about privacy, then it was about racism, then it was about mental health, then it was about protecting your children. Which version am I supposed to believe? The accusation hit its mark with devastating accuracy. Meghan's composure finally cracked completely, her voice shaking with barely controlled anger. How dare you sit there and question my mental health struggles? Do you have any idea what it's like to have your every move scrutinized, to be torn apart by the media every single day, to feel so isolated and hopeless that you consider ending your own life? I know exactly what that's like. Whoopi fired back without hesitation. I've been black in Hollywood for over 40 years. I've been torn apart, criticized, scrutinized, and dismissed more times than you can count. The difference is, I didn't monetize my pain. I didn't turn my struggles into a brand. Sunny tried to defuse the situation, her voice gentle but urgent. I think we all need to take a step back here. These are serious topics that deserve thoughtful discussion. Thoughtful discussion. Meghan turned to face Sunny, her voice rising. There's nothing thoughtful about this ambush. This is exactly the kind of treatment that drove me away from public life in the first place. I'm being attacked for having the courage to speak my truth, for refusing to stay silent in the face of injustice. Whoopi slammed her hand on the table, the sound echoing through the suddenly silent studio. Stop it. Just stop with the victim narrative. You weren't driven away from public life. You chose to leave because you couldn't handle the fact that being a royal isn't the same as being a Hollywood celebrity. You couldn't accept that sometimes duty comes before personal happiness. Duty. Meghan's voice was incredulous now, all pretense of calm completely abandoned. What duty? The duty to smile while being called names? The duty to protect an institution that wouldn't protect me or my child? The duty to pretend everything was fine while I was literally fighting for my life? The duty to honor your commitments? Whoopi's voice boomed across the studio. The duty to support your husband's family instead of tearing them down in public. The duty to think about something bigger than yourself for once in your privileged life. The words hung in the air like a physical blow. The studio audience was completely silent now, some covering their mouths in shock at the raw intensity of the confrontation unfolding before them. Even the seasoned crew members, who had seen countless heated moments on The View over the years, seemed stunned by the viciousness of this exchange. Meghan stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that made several people in the audience jump. Privileged life? You think this has been privilege? You think having my character assassinated on a global scale, having lies spread about me in every tabloid, having my own father sell stories about me to the press, you think that's privilege? I think marrying into one of the most famous families in the world and then complaining about being famous is privilege, Whoopi retorted, also rising to her feet. I think having access to platforms that most people could never dream of and using them primarily to settle personal scores is privilege. I think making millions of dollars talking about how hard your life is while people are struggling to put food on their tables is the definition of privilege. Joy looked desperately at the producers off camera, clearly hoping someone would intervene, but the cameras kept rolling. This was television gold, even if it was becoming increasingly uncomfortable to watch. Sunny sat frozen in her chair, torn between her instinct to support a woman she'd previously defended and her growing discomfort with the direction of the conversation. Meghan's voice dropped to a dangerously quiet level, her words dripping with controlled fury. You know what your problem is, Whoopi? You're so invested in being the gatekeeper of who gets to be considered a victim, who gets to speak out about injustice, that you can't see past your own biases. You've decided I don't deserve sympathy. Because I married well, because I had opportunities. But oppression doesn't disappear just because you have money or status. And your problem, Whoopi shot back, pointing a finger directly at Meghan. is that you think having a platform means everyone has to listen to you without question. You think being hurt gives you the right to hurt others. You think your pain is more important than the pain you've caused to Harry's family, to the people who believed in you, to the institution that welcomed you with open arms. Welcome me. Meghan's laugh was harsh and bitter. Is that what you call it when they leak stories about me to the press? When they refuse to defend me against racist attacks? When they tell me to just bear it because that's what's expected? That's your definition of welcome? Whoopi's eyes blazed with fury now, all pretense of professional composure abandoned. I call it reality. I call it the same treatment that every person who marries into a prominent family has to deal with. But instead of rising above it, instead of proving your critics wrong through your actions, you chose to burn everything down and then wonder why people question your motives. The confrontation had reached a boiling point, with both women standing and facing each other across the table, like gladiators in an arena. The tension was so palpable that it seemed to vibrate through the air itself, and everyone in the studio could sense that they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years to come. But even this wasn't the end. The worst was yet to come, and what happened next would ensure that this interview would go down as one of the most explosive moments in daytime television history. Meghan's composure finally shattered completely as she leaned forward across the table, her voice trembling with rage. You want to talk about burning things down? Let's talk about how you've spent this entire interview trying to tear me down simply because you can't stand that someone younger and more relevant is getting attention that you think belongs to you. The accusation struck like lightning. Whoopi's face went stone cold, her eyes narrowing to dangerous slits behind her glasses. More relevant? Girl, you have lost your mind if you think 15 minutes of royal fame makes you more relevant than someone who's been fighting real battles for decades. Real battles. Meghan's voice cracked with fury. What would you know about real battles? You've been sitting at this table for years, comfortable and safe, judging everyone else while contributing nothing meaningful to the conversations that actually matter. At least I'm out there trying to make a difference in the world. Joy frantically gestured to the producers, her eyes wide with panic. We need to go to commercial. We need to. No. Whoopi's voice boomed through the studio, silencing everyone. She wants to do this. Then let's do this. You think you're making a difference? The only difference you've made is turning your husband against his own family and using your mixed-race identity as a shield whenever someone calls you out on your behavior. The studio gasped collectively. Several audience members audibly gasped at the brutal directness of Whoopi's words. Sunny looked horrified, her hand covering her mouth as she realized this had crossed every line of professional decorum. Meghan's face went pale, then flushed red with absolute fury. How dare you reduce my experience to a shield? How dare you minimize the racism I've faced? You of all people should understand what it's like to be attacked for who you are, but instead you're sitting there attacking me just like everyone else. Don't you dare compare your experience to mine. Whoopi roared, her voice shaking the studio. I fought for my place in this industry when doors were slammed in my face because of my race, my gender, my appearance. I didn't marry my way into relevance and then complain when it came with responsibilities. Meghan slammed her hands on the table, the sound echoing through the silent studio. I earned everything I got. I worked as an actress. I built my own career. I advocated for causes I believed in long before I met Harry. But you can't see past your own jealousy to acknowledge that. Jealousy. Whoopi's laugh was cold and cutting. Jealous of what? Your inability to handle criticism? Your talent for making everything about yourself? Your gift for alienating everyone who tries to help you? Trust me, sweetheart, there's nothing about your life that I envy. At least I don't spend my days sitting behind a desk tearing down other women. Meghan shot back, her voice reaching a fever pitch. At least I'm not so bitter and washed up that I have to attack people just to feel relevant. The words hit Whoopi like a physical blow. For a moment, the veteran host was speechless, her face cycling through shock, hurt, and then pure, unadulterated rage. When she finally spoke, her voice was deadly quiet. Get out. What? Meghan's anger faltered slightly, confusion flickering across her face. I said get out, Whoopi repeated, her voice growing stronger. Get out of my studio. Get out of my show. You want to call me washed up? You want to come on my show and disrespect me in front of my audience? Then you can leave. Right now. Meghan looked around the studio wildly, as if suddenly realizing where she was and what had just happened. Joy and Sunny sat in stunned silence, neither knowing how to respond to the unprecedented situation unfolding before them. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every moment of the most explosive confrontation in the View's history. "You can't kick me off," Meghan said, her voice shaking slightly. "We're in the middle of a live show. This is unprofessional. Unprofessional." Whoopi's voice rose again. "You want to talk to me about unprofessional after what you just did? After you came into my house and attacked me personally?" Security. Two security guards appeared at the edge of the set, clearly unsure about what they were supposed to do. The producers were frantically signaling from behind the cameras, but Whoopi was beyond caring about protocols or proper procedures. Meghan looked at the security guards, then back at Whoopi, her face a mixture of shock and defiance. "This is exactly what I'm talking about. This is exactly the kind of treatment that drove me away from public life. You can't handle being challenged, so you resort to having me physically removed." "No," Whoopi said, standing up and pointing toward the exit. "This is what happens when you mistake being a guest for being entitled to say whatever you want without consequences. You came here thinking you could manipulate the narrative like you do everywhere else, but this isn't your show. This is mine." Sunny finally found her voice, her words coming out in a rush. "Maybe we should all just take a breath and there's nothing to take a breath about." Whoopi cut her off. "She made her choice when she decided to attack me personally. Actions have consequences, something she apparently never learned." Meghan slowly gathered her purse, her movements deliberate and controlled despite the chaos around her. Her face had settled into a mask of cold dignity, but her hands were visibly shaking. "You know what, Whoopi? You're right about one thing. Actions do have consequences, and this conversation has shown everyone exactly who you really are." "And what's that?" Whoopi challenged, her arms crossed as she stared down at her former guest. "Someone who's so threatened by other women's success that you'll tear them down rather than lift them up. Someone who's forgotten what it means to support each other instead of competing for scraps." Meghan's voice was steady now, but cold as ice. "I feel sorry for you. I really do." Whoopi's response was swift and brutal. "Save your pity for someone who needs it, and save your victim story for someone who's buying it. Because after today, after people see how you really act when you don't get your way, I don't think you'll find as many sympathetic ears as you're used to." Meghan turned to face the cameras directly, addressing the audience with the same poised demeanor she'd shown countless times before, but now there was something harder underneath. "To everyone watching, I want you to remember this moment. Remember how a woman of color was treated when she tried to speak her truth. Remember how quickly support can turn to attack when you refuse to stay silent." "Oh, please." Whoopi threw her hands up in exasperation. "Even now, even as you're leaving, you're playing the victim card. Take some responsibility for your actions for once in your life." But Meghan was already walking toward the exit, her head held high despite the chaos she was leaving behind. She paused at the edge of the set, turning back one final time. "Good luck with your show, Whoopi. I hope someday you learn the difference between holding people accountable and just being cruel." With that, she walked off the set, leaving behind a studio full of shocked faces and a host who was still seething with anger. Whoopi watched her go, then turned back to the cameras, her chest rising and falling as she tried to compose herself. "We'll be right back," she said through gritted teeth, and the cameras finally cut to commercial. The most explosive confrontation in daytime television history was over, but the reverberations would be felt for years to come. In just 30 minutes, two powerful women had destroyed any possibility of reconciliation, and the entire world had watched it happen live. The View had seen many heated moments over the years, but nothing had ever come close to the raw, unfiltered fury that had just played out on national television. As the studio lights dimmed and the audience sat in stunned silence, one thing was clear. This was a moment that would be replayed, analyzed, and talked about for decades to come. And neither Whoopi Goldberg nor Meghan Markle would ever be able to take back what had just been said.